Okay, so I was just going to go back to the beginning of the digestive system, even though we talked about a couple of these slides, just to have a clear point for starting, especially since it was a while ago that we did this makeup material. I did go in and update the file. I might not have thrown it on Moodle yet, just today. And all I changed in this file, if you've already printed out, there's no reason to reprint it. All I did is I added in the chapter references for the ones that were missing. Some of them were missing. And so as we were going through this material, I explained to you that like each one of these topics has an entire chapter. And for some of them, I'm showing you one slide. Right, I'm not covering all of that material. But if you're really interested in the digestive system, you could go to chapter 34 in your free OpenStax textbook and fill in the gaps, right? It's all there for you. So I was just adding those reference points. So when we think about digestion from a mammalian standpoint, we sort of think about these 4 steps of digestion: ingestion, digestion, absorption of nutrients, and elimination. And we can sort of visualize that in this cat's body. But really, all of those things happen even in our simpler organisms. They just look a little bit differently. And digestion is one of those topics I want to spend a little bit more time on than some of the others because it's so critical, right? When you think about an evolutionary perspective for organisms, we need to survive and reproduce, and we have to be able to get nutrients to survive. Right? One of the characteristics of life is that things that are alive can acquire and process nutrients. And this is how we do that, through our digestive system. We also have, when we think about the mammalian system, we sort of start with mechanical digestion, the chewing and the breaking up of food into smaller pieces. That's not something that's available to all organisms. Right? Not every organism can break up food into smaller pieces. Some organisms just have to eat food whole and only eat food that is a size they can reasonably bring into their mouth or bring into their cell, right? Chemical digestion is going to break things up into smaller nutrients, which can be absorbed, and undigested material has to be eliminated in the waste stream. We looked a little bit at sponges as our very, very simple organisms. Remember, they don't even have tissues, and so our sponges only have the cellular level of organization. So some of the cells in the sponge's body are specialized for gathering food, and they're going to just essentially be doing phagocytosis. They're going to be picking up food from the environment and bringing it in through the cell in cellular eating. They have some structures to help them extract more food from the environment. These cells that are shown here in blue and highlighted over here are called choanocytes or collar cells, and those cells specialize in harvesting food. The flagella creates the water flow that pulls water into the sponge's body and out the center chimney, out this way. And as that water is pulled through, food particles from the water column are picked up. They stick to the collar of the collar cell, move down the surface of the cell, and are brought into a food vacuole by phagocytosis. So this is really simple, just cellular level eating. We moved up to our hydra, which we watched in a video, consume Daphnia. I did actually go through more of these slides than I realized. I think I already said this. As we bring that Daphnia in, it's going to be anchored by the cnidocytes and pulled into the digestive cavity. It's going to be washed in enzymes to digest it, and the nutrients will be absorbed through the body wall and transported to the rest of the body simply through diffusion. And then undigested material will go back out through the mouth and exit the gastrovascular cavity. If we move on to something, there was something else in between there. Boy, if we move on to something like a worm, we move up to an organism that has a complete digestive tract. So they have both a mouth and an anus. So instead of the food coming in and the waste going out the same opening, they're going to move food through the entire body. But this little worm, if we think of this as being an earthworm eating soil, that worm doesn't have teeth to chew it up and break it up into smaller pieces. It's going to just sort of hoover in soil with food particles into the body, and it's going to go through the pharynx and down the esophagus into a region known as the crop. And we're going to see crops in some organisms. And the crop is basically a holding vat, a space where food can be stored temporarily. And it's also a place where moisture is added to the food. So when we eat food in our mouth, we have saliva in our mouth. And that saliva has early digestive enzymes. So as soon as the food comes into our mouth, the digestive enzymes in our saliva coat it, they moisten it, and they start to break it down, right? And then we chew, carrying out mechanical digestion. Organisms that don't bring food into a mouth for chewing are going to use the crop for moistening. And so the crop is going to add solution to the food and start to moisten it and hydrolyze some of the materials inside. And then the gizzard is going to do the chewing action. So in the case of the earthworm, the gizzard is going to use soil particles and small bits of sand and silica from the food from the soil that's been ingested with the food to grind against the food materials and chew it up, right? They don't have teeth, so they use this muscular gizzard action for that. And then as food moves through the intestine and the digestive tract, nutrients are going to be absorbed, water is going to be reclaimed by the body, and dry, undigestible material will be expelled as waste, right? The bird digestive system is essentially the same as the earthworm. Food comes in. We don't have any chewing because there's no teeth in that beak. So the food comes in and is swallowed down into the crop. If any of you have chickens, you've ever picked up your chicken and you feel that warm, thick bulb below the base of their neck, that's their crop. And especially at nighttime, you'll feel that it's full. And the food in there is just getting moist and beginning to hydrolyze some of the molecules, and it's stored temporarily until there's room for it to move into the rest of the system. Next step is the gizzard. For birds, that gizzard might contain small rocks, pieces of sand that they pick up as they're foraging, pieces of hard material that they ingest intentionally to function as grinding surfaces in their gizzard, right? When we were at the Benesky Museum, did he show you the digestion stones from the dinosaurs? Do you guys remember seeing that? Okay, so there's certain dinosaurs that are thought to have basically consumed whole trees and then had large rocks in their digestive system, and the rocks were just kind of bound against the bark and break it down. It's the same idea. You don't have anything to chew with, but you have this heavy surface and muscular action against it to essentially function like teeth inside the body in the gizzard. Okay, we have more convolution in the large intestine. Anytime we have coiling and wrapping, we're increasing surface area for digestion, right? So the longer that intestine is relative to body size, the more digestive surface you have. Move up to mammals, and before we just talk about mammals like a human representative, I want to briefly mention ruminants because they're fascinating. All of our deer and all of our cow type organisms, as well as goats, are ruminants. And they have a very complex four-chambered stomach. So when food goes in, sheep also, I should have mentioned, food goes down the esophagus and into the rumen, this big section up here. And that rumen is full of microorganisms, and those microorganisms are capable of breaking down cellulose. And so when it goes into the rumen, the food moves them around in the rumen. Liquid separates from solid. The solid forms a mass in that rumen, and the rumen does a fermentation process, basically. Food in the rumen undergoes some fermentation. Cellulose begins to break down, and the solids sort of move into the reticulum, where they condense and form something that's called a cud. If you've ever watched a ruminant eat, you see like the bulbous cud comes back up their throat, and then they chew, and then they swallow again. So the rumen contents, the solids from the rumen, are actually formed into a solid mass, which moves back up the esophagus and into the mouth for additional chewing after it's been fermented. And so they chew it again, swallow it back down, and this time it actually goes into the omasum where water salts and small organic materials are released by microorganisms to help continue the digestive process. And then they move into the abomasum, which is actually like a true stomach, where the digestion that's analogous to what the rest of mammals do occurs. And then from there, we move into the intestine for absorption and water reclamation. Okay. These organisms are relying on their microbiome, the microorganisms, the fungus and the bacteria in their rumen, to help them to get more nutrition out of their food than they could get otherwise. And these guys are very sensitive to something that's known as rumen bloat. The rumen process, the fermentation process, produces a lot of gas, which is why these guys fart a lot and release a lot of methane into the atmosphere, which is in large factory farms is a concern for climate change because they're a huge source of methane. But it also means that if they are eating an inappropriate diet, they can actually get bloat and get very ill. And so most of our factory farmed cattle are actually in early liver failure because of chronic rumen bloat, because they're not designed to eat corn. And so when we finish cattle on corn, it causes too much gas buildup in the rumen because they're really designed to be eating grass. And so that's just sort of, when we think about raising livestock, they have this very unique digestive system that is built to just harvest a lot of nutrients from things like grasses. And when we give them seeds instead, they don't, it doesn't function in the same way. It's a pretty delicate balance. These guys are also really sensitive to like being flipped over on their back. Can be dangerous if they're held on their back for too long because rumen contents can spill into other places. And the rumen contents really need to stay in the rumen or they can be damaging and cause infections.
So, like, is that why, like, when you feed cows, it's like they're going to get fermented?
No.
And then
no idea.
Do not do that anyway because apples are not nuts.
Well,
I hang out with a lot of cows.
It depends on how many apples you're giving your cows, right? I think all things in moderation. Like, even if you're designed to be a grass eater, you're going to, I mean, have you ever seen a horse that could pass up an apple tree? Like, no, it's going to stop and eat it, right? Even if you're designed to eat something else, like, that doesn't mean that you can't eat those occasionally. It's when they become your sole diet. Like, you can't live on apples if you're a cow and be healthy, right? I don't know about getting cows drunk. It's outside my reference. Right. That would be my suspicion. That would be my expectation. Yeah. Which is why orchards are such a hot spot for stumbling deer, right? They like to come get drunk on drop apples. It's like they get addicted to drop apples. Okay, this is the digestive system we're most familiar with, our own digestive system. It looks kind of like all of the others. Obviously, we aren't ruminants, so we don't have the four-chambered stomach. We don't have a crop or a gizzard because instead we do all of the action of the crop and the gizzard in the mouth. And so when we chew our food, we moisten it, we add fluid to it, we soften it up, and we break it down into smaller pieces. So all that's happening in the mouth instead of in a specialized organ as we go through. But the rest is the same. We have the acid vat in the stomach. We have pH change back to neutral as we move into the intestine. Food is digested and absorbed in the small intestine, water reclamation in the large intestine, and undigested material is passed out. I'm not going to worry about all the accessory organs that do important things, but it's here if you want to read about it. No, it's just fun fact. Like the contents of your stomach are about pH 2. Hydrochloric acid is pH 2. So the stomach is really acidic, which is why you can have acid reflux. That's that acidic coming back up. But as soon as it leaves the stomach and goes into the small intestine, it's washed with bicarbonate. And so it's actually flushed with basic solution and it comes back up to neutral as it moves through the intestine. So it's only at that really low damaging pH in the stomach. And the stomach lining turns over like once every 24 hours or something, because the lining of the stomach, those cells are being digested also by those acids. So they have to be constantly regrowing and regenerating. Okay. Then we have the circulatory system. I'm not going to spend quite as much time on the circulatory system because many of our organisms don't have one, but they have to have some way to do these jobs. And so the circulatory system in mammals is the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood. And the purpose, the function of the circulatory system is to transport stuff and to regulate temperature if the body is able to regulate temperature, which not all bodies are, right? We talked about endothermy and ectothermy. So we transport nutrients, so the food that's being absorbed from the digestive processes. We also transport gases, so oxygen in for metabolic activity, carbon dioxide out as a waste gas. It also provides the transport mechanism for hormones and chemical signals, as well as for metabolic waste materials. And then temperature regulation really occurs in our endotherms, our birds and our mammals, who are going to use the capillaries near the surface for heat release, are going to do countercurrent flow, like we talked about in our animals who spend time with their bodies in cold substrates like ice or snow or Arctic water. Those kinds of organisms are going to use the circulatory system also for temperature regulation. Yeah, so in the absence of a circulatory system, they're going to rely on diffusion to do all of that transport. Okay, and most of the organisms that also don't have a circulatory system are also not going to be able to maintain a constant body temperature, and so they're going to be relying on behavioral responses to their environment to deal with their body temperature, or they're going to live in a place where temperature is relatively constant. Okay. Some of these organisms get by dealing with seasonality completely by dying. And so like a lot of invertebrate organisms will lay their eggs or their offspring in a stable state that can overwinter, and then the adults just die. And the next generation starts up the following spring. And so they don't have to worry about dealing with extreme cold temperatures, for example. So we looked at our planaria here, and all of this tissue of the planaria that's shown in brown here is gastrovascular cavity. So food comes in through the mouth and then branches along the gastrovascular cavity. And all of these branching pieces are creating surface area for food to be absorbed, for nutrients to be absorbed by the surrounding cells. And so we're just going to move materials by osmosis and diffusion. They're moving fluids and moving solids. The hydra is similar. All of this is gastrovascular cavity, right? So all the cells that are adjacent to the gastrovascular cavity are just going to pull nutrients by osmosis and diffusion, and then pass them to their neighboring cells as needed. Some of our invertebrates, like our mollusks that we were talking about last week, and our arthropods that we're going to talk about still today, have an open circulatory system. And this means that in some parts of the organism's body, blood is contained in vessels. In other places, it pools freely and flows into a space instead of being contained within tubes. So in an open circulatory system, we have something called the hemocoel. And remember, this seal term from coelom is just a space. And so this is the blood space or the blood cavity, okay? And so in the hemocoel, the blood, and sometimes it's a hemolymph, both a combination of lymphatic fluid and blood fluid, flow freely in this space. And so instead of having capillaries to deliver to the organs are just bathed directly in the blood solution. And so waste materials can diffuse out into the hemocoel, and nutrients and needed materials can be diffused in. So if we look here in our grasshopper, the grasshopper has its circulatory system shown here in green. No. respiratory system. All one. These are heart-like muscular pumping sections, and they're valve-like openings where fluid from this organ flows down and fills this body cavity, completely surrounding the digestive system, which is shown in blue. Right? So the blood is just sort of flowing freely around the digestive system. So as nutrients move out through the digestive system, they're joining that space. As waste materials need to be moved in, they can be moved in, and then we continue to pump through. We're going to be mixing waste and good, oxygen and deoxygenated in that space. The organism on the bottom is a bivalve, like a scallop or a clam or a mussel, and they have a similar structure. Part of their, there's the heart here, and part of the blood is contained in tubes, and then part of it flows freely, sort of like out into this space around the stomach, and out into this space around these organs. And so they have pockets where blood flows freely, and then it gets picked back up into a tube and moves somewhere else and then flows freely again. So this open circulatory system is less efficient in some ways, but these organisms also have lower nutrient needs and lower oxygen needs. And so the inefficiency is not as big of a deal as when we need to have efficiency because you have higher metabolic demands. Don't know how their clotting works. And the cricket also has hemolymph, so it's blood and lymphatic fluid together. They have an interesting fluid, and some of it is separated by some of the body segments to some extent, and I don't know like how much that increases vulnerability. I would assume that, you know, puncturing a hole in the hemocoel would be pretty damaging, right? You could lose a lot of your fluids quickly that way. But I don't know what the repair mechanisms are like. That's a really good question. Not that I'm aware of. I'm like, I hate to say like that there isn't some freakish animal out there that I don't know about, because I don't know all the animals. The best of my understanding is blood is either pretty fully enclosed in a network of arteries, veins, and capillaries, or it flows from some sort of organ or tube into a space where it pools and then gets picked back up by organ or tube and moved on. Those are like, I don't know of something where it's like pulling in tissue, unless that's due to injury. Because you have mixing of materials that you want to get and materials that you want to get rid of. And so instead of having all of the oxygen concentrated in one fluid that's not mixing with the deoxygenated fluid, they're all kind of in there together. And so those things have to get sorted out. So we're not moving as much per volume, if that makes sense. Okay. A closed circulatory system involves blood enclosed in vessels, basically have a plumbing system to the organism's body to transport the blood fluid. This includes arteries, arterioles, capillaries, venules, and veins, which are just tubes of different sizes. So we have big tubes going from the main organs like the pumping heart, and we have little tubes going out to the accessory organs where it's going to drop off oxygen and nutrients and pick up waste material and carbon dioxide. So in the case of our simple little earthworm over here, the earthworm has a series of pumps that function as hearts, and then it has two main vessels that run along its body. one on the dorsal side and one on the ventral side. So as a dorsal vessel and a ventral vessel. The hearts pump fluid down those vessels, and then it branches off into smaller and smaller branches as it delivers to the digestive system and the reproductive system and all of the other areas that need that material. In our fish, we have the heart here, and fish have a two-chambered heart. They have an atrium and a ventricle, and they're going to always be pumping deoxygenated blood through the heart, and the heart pumps out to the gills. And as we get to the gills, oxygen is picked up from the gill surface and carried all the way to the rest of the body, and then deoxygenated blood comes back to the heart for the next circuit. And so fish body does one big looping circuit from heart to gills to body or systems back to heart to gills. As we move up our vertebrates, we go from our fish, which has a two-chambered heart, to amphibians and reptiles, which have a three-chambered heart. And so here we start to separate oxygenated blood in red from deoxygenated blood in blue, but there's some mixing in the third chamber. And so we're getting a little bit more efficient. We'll see in some reptiles, we actually have a flap inside this lower chamber that helps to separate the deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. And as we do that, we increase the efficiency of oxygen delivery. And then by the time we get up to birds and mammals, as well as crocodiles, which are still reptiles, we have a four-chambered heart. We have a complete separation here of oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood. And so as our oxygen demand increases, so does the efficiency of the circulatory system. Whirlwind tour of comparative circulatory systems, which you would like normally spend a week on. Okay, any other questions about circulatory systems? All right. Adjacent to in purpose and often in physical space is the circulatory system is the respiratory system. And so the circulatory system is transporting nutrients and gases. The respiratory system is getting those gases in and out. Okay, so the respiratory system has a really large surface area for gas exchange, and it's going to be responsible for bringing oxygen in to the body and getting it to where it can be delivered to the cells, and then taking carbon dioxide away, right? So our necessary gas for cellular respiration is oxygen. Our waste gas is carbon dioxide. The circulatory system evolves to make that exchange, to maximize the ability to bring oxygen in and to cart away waste gas as it's built up. So in our mammal system, we bring oxygen in through the mouth and the nasal cavity, into the pharynx, down to the larynx, into the trachea, and ultimately out to the lungs, where we have a large moist surface area for gas exchange. We have simpler versions of this in our other organisms as we build our way up to this highly vascularized, really efficient system. Right? The mammal system, all of this respiratory surface is very, very intricately tied to circulatory system so that gas can diffuse directly from the respiratory system into the circulatory system and directly back from the circulatory system into the respiratory system to exhale waste gases. Our simplest respiratory system is, again, just osmosis, diffusion. Our flatworms that live in a moist environment are going to just be bringing oxygen in from the water into their body and moving it through their entire body simply by diffusion. Carbon dioxide is moved to the body surface and washes away as the water flows over their body. Those of you who might be interested in working with terrestrial salamanders, this is our friend Plethodon cinereus, the redback salamander. Probably highest biomass of any vertebrate in the New England forest. They're extremely prevalent, handfuls of them in the soil if you start digging. And these guys don't have lungs. So they're an amphibian who doesn't have lungs. They do all of their respiration through their skin. And so whether they're in moist soil, dry air, they can't sustain long-term periods of time in dry air, or actually in some water in a puddle, they're going to be extracting oxygen from their surrounding environment and bringing it into their bodies. They don't have super high metabolic needs. They don't need a ton of oxygen, and they can get everything they need simply through moving oxygen through their skin into their circulatory system and diffusing it around. They do have a heart, they do have a transport system, but they don't have lungs to maximize bringing oxygen into that transport system or taking carbon dioxide away. Okay. This is a turtle, and this is the cloaca. Be honest, how many of you know what a cloaca is? Not very many. We had this conversation a couple weeks ago. So the cloaca is a single opening that is used for both reproduction and waste elimination. And so many of our reptiles, amphibians, and birds have a cloaca. And so reproductive gametes are formed and exit or enter the body through the cloaca, and waste material exits the body through the cloaca. Often those same organisms have one combined waste material. So fecal waste, undigested waste material, joins with metabolic waste, which would be urinary waste in our bodies, into a paste-like substance, or a rather hard substance that exits through the cloaca. And that joining occurs back further up in the body. So this cloaca is sort of the one opening for multitasks, right? In this turtle, and in most turtles have some degree of this. The cloaca actually opens up into these cloacal pouches. Oh, it looks like a heart. And those cloacal pouches have extended surface area on them. And so when turtles are still functioning and you see them swimming underneath the ice in a pond, you see them active in winter, the way that they're remaining active in the low oxygen content of that pond is through something called cloacal pumping, or less formally, butt breathing, right? They're literally pumping water into their cloaca instead of out, through this pouch and back out, and they're getting oxygen from the surrounding environment cutaneously. There's a species in Australia who can actually bring in 12% of its total oxygen needs just through cutaneous breathing, through cloacal pumping. And so they don't even just do it in the winter, like just kind of all the time. They're accessorizing their oxygen intake through their cloaca. So fun fact about turtles, they can breathe through their butts, which is kind of cool. When we move up to arthropods, which we're going to talk about today, particularly insects, they have a different mechanism to bring in oxygen. So they have a way to pump oxygen directly in and bathe their cells in it, but they have pumps all along the length of their body instead of just having, respiration through the nose and mouth. And so this is the body of some insect, right? And all of these tubes are respiratory tubes. And there's an opening on the surface of the animal's body that goes into this tube and out down all of these smaller trachea and tracheoles directly out to body cells. So if you've ever seen a bee sitting on a flower pumping its abdomen up and down, you guys seen this before? A grasshopper pumping its abdomen. What it's doing with that action is pumping oxygen in through its tracheoles. And so it's going to be bringing air into these little openings called spiracles and bathing it directly onto its cells. So in order to attain flight, right, this is especially important in flying insects, we need a lot of oxygen. And so this is evolved as a way to crank oxygen in to those cells to support the muscle firing of flight. You guys really bored by this? I think this is so cool. Some of you look like you're done with lecture already. So tired. Okay. Huh? It's Tuesday? Yeah, I As we move it, kind of jumping around, I went from amphibians and reptiles back to fish, covering all the vertebrates in weird order. The fish system is also pretty interesting. Fish don't use lungs. Instead, they use gills, right? And so when a fish brings water into its mouth, both with food and for the purpose of breathing, brings fresh water into its mouth, some of that water pushes out over the gills and then out along the side of the body. And as that water pushes over the gills are made up of several layers of these finger-like structures called lamellae. And so we have all these finger-like structures, again, maximizing surface area. As the water flows over those finger-like structures, oxygen is absorbed in, carbon dioxide is dumped out. And as the water flows, the fresh oxygen is coming into the body and the waste gases are pushing away from the body as the animal swims, right? So when they talk about sharks having to swim or they'll die, it's a slightly overstated fun fact, but the way they move material across their gills is to swim. So bringing that fresh water over their gills. If you've ever watched a goldfish sit in a bowl and just go like this, right, with their sides, that's a structure called an operculum that covers the gills, and they can flap that operculum, creating a water current to wash the gills, so they can wash the carbon dioxide gas away without swimming through the water. So all fish have the ability to divert water from the mouth either into the stomach or out to the gills. And so they have structures inside that help them to control where the water goes. And it's mostly going to go out over the gills in those species that don't actively drink, which we'll talk about in a minute. The goldfish and any fish with an operculum can supplement that direct flow with washing by creating a current. Okay. Then we move up to birds. Birds have an extremely high demand for oxygen because flight requires a lot of firing of muscles. And so in order to support flight, they have to have a very high metabolic rate, a very high oxygen demand. They just need to burn ATP like crazy to support flight. And so avian respiration is extremely efficient. It allows them to support flight. It also allows them to extract sufficient oxygen from high altitudes, right? When birds are flying, they're in a different pressure level than we are down here on the ground. And as you go up in the atmosphere, oxygen concentration goes down. So as a bird soars higher and higher, it's going to have less oxygen available to it than it would when it comes down into the forest. So in order to do that, it has a two-step breathing system. Air comes in, down through the trachea into a posterior air sac, and it's going to be pushed through the lung up into the anterior air sac, which is inflated. And that oxygenated air as it comes in is going to deliver oxygen through that pathway and pick up waste gas, so that when we get here, we've got mostly deoxygenated high CO2 air that needs to go out. And then the second step is actually to close this valve and to pump the anterior air sac back out through the trachea. So it's in, through, and back out. But we have, instead of sort of making a U-turn in there, it's actually a one flow direction, right? We go in, it creates a continuous flow as opposed to a circuit in the body. And this allows it to be more efficient. Air flows opposite of blood, so there's direct absorption across a concentration gradient as those fluids pass each other in neighboring vessels. I believe that their system is the same. Yeah, I would have to look at a diagram of ostrich physiology. It may have lost some, like sometimes depending on how essential the efficiency is, it may lose some of that efficiency, but usually we don't completely restructure anatomical features. if there's a loss, like if that system still works, right? It's all about how evolutionary expensive it is to maintain and whether you should evolve something different. And I don't know, but I assume that it's the same. Another great question I don't know the answer to. You guys are always keeping me right on the edge. Human respiratory system we're a little bit more familiar with. Air comes in through the nose and the mouth, down into the lungs, which are filled with these moist, high surface area spaces. Humidity in the lungs is about 100%, got maximum moisture, so gas diffuses easily through that fluid. We have big airspace, lots of room for diffusion to happen, and we're going to be bringing all of our waste gas back to the lungs for elimination, and we're going to be bringing all of our fresh air into the lungs for distribution to the rest of the body. So analogous to what we saw in our 2, 3, and 4 chamber hearts in other organisms. But like birds, mammals also have a fairly high oxygen demand. So we have sort of the second most efficient respiratory system. Okay, this is looking at a human lung, pretty analogous for all mammals. Air is shown in white and red shows the blood. So all of the red vessels that are shown here are the circulatory system. All of the white vessels are the respiratory system. And so you can see how perfectly they pair so that we can have gas exchange from the plumbing system to the getting the air in and out system, right? From circulatory to respiratory, back out. Okay. Our next system is the urinary system. And the urinary system is really responsible for osmotic regulation, so maintaining water balance homeostasis, and for excretion, getting rid of waste materials. Okay. In mammals, the urinary system includes kidneys, the ureters, the tubes that connect the kidneys to the bladder, and the urethra, which dumps waste fluid to the outside. In other organisms, we don't necessarily have all of those systems, but we still do these same main tasks. We regulate bloodstream homeostasis, maintaining proper water balance. We process metabolic wastes and toxins and eliminate them from the body. And we remove extra water and nutrients from the bloodstream for disposal, right? So we're really, this is the organ of water balance and maintaining water homeostasis. And then secondarily is eliminating metabolic wastes. When we think about wastes, I think we tend to always think about digestive waste, but really the digestive waste, the feces that's produced by organisms, is just undigested material. All of the rest of the waste that's a byproduct of metabolism goes through this system, goes through the urinary system. And in some organisms, those two join up, like I was talking about, but in others, they stay separate. Okay, this is just looking at some urinary systems in some of our invertebrates. I love planaria. So over here on the right, we have planaria. And planaria actually have really simple kidneys. They're called protonephridia, so early nephridia, unlike the nephrons that are the structure of the mammalian kidney. And these protonephridia include an excretory pore to the outside, a flame cell for processing, and then a tubule. So waste materials, and the system is all along the organism's body, shown in green. Pretty analogous to where the digestive system was, but not a whole lot of overlap in the core, right? The center of the animal's body is mostly digestive system, but where the digestive system branches out to the edges, now we also have this waste removal system. And so waste materials that are a byproduct of metabolism, things that the organism needs to dump out, are all going to collect in these tubules and come to the flame cell where it's processed, and interstitial fluid will move into the flame cell to either hydrate the materials that need to move out or to be conserved. And then the waste material will flow out through the excretory pore and just wash away from the outside of the animal's body. Okay. An ant and other insects have a structure known as the Malpighian tubule, And these are collecting tubes within the organism's hemocoel. So this is that fluid-filled space containing blood and hemolymph. And the Malpighian tubules are going to be collecting metabolic waste and excess fluid from that cavity and then dumping them into directly the intestine. And so the Malpighian tubules do the collecting in the hemocoel, and then all that metabolic and water waste is just going to go into the digestive waste and out the digestive tract with the rest of the undigested materials. Okay. Earthworms have their own little kidney-like organ for each segment of their body. It's called a nephridia. They have a nephridiopore, and then they have the nephrostome. So they collect materials from the segment in front and bring them through this structure where they continue to collect material from the capillary network and ultimately out through a collecting duct and into this bladder and then out to the outside of the body. So waste materials from this segment get dumped out in the segment behind, and it moves back down the entire length of the animal's body, dumping out materials. Okay. As we go through our invertebrates, we've been so far mostly talking about organisms that spend their life in water, right? And living in water is really good because water is always available. You don't have to worry about conserving it. But you do have to deal with the balance between the solute concentration within your body and the solute concentration outside of your body. In order to maintain water balance, you don't want to be constantly bringing on water via osmosis. You don't want to be constantly losing water via osmosis either, right? So some organisms are what we call hypoosmotic regulators. And this is in any organism whose body has a greater solute concentration than the surrounding water. So think an organism living in fresh water. The solute concentration of your freshwater lake is relatively low compared to the solute concentration of your animal's body, right? So that means that salt wants to leave the animal's body and go out to the surrounding fluid, and water wants to come into the animal's body from the surrounding fluid. So they're going to have to constantly regulate that. Hyperosmotic regulators have the opposite problem. A hyperosmotic regulator, the animal's body has a lower solute concentration than the surrounding water. So think a saltwater animal, right, where there's maybe a higher concentration in the surrounding solution. Then the organism is trying to take on solutes, like salt, and losing water to the surrounding environment. So even though they're surrounded by fluid, they are at risk for severe dehydration because there's a higher solute concentration outside their body. That's a hyperosmotic regulator. And then some organisms are known as isotonic organisms. And these are organisms who allow their body to be at equilibrium with the surrounding water. So water goes in and out, salt goes in and out, but there's no net movement, no gain or loss of either solutes or fluids for those organisms. Okay. Isotonic organisms become increasingly rare as we move up into vertebrate organisms. Many of our invertebrates are isotonic, but few of our vertebrates are. Okay. It's easy because you don't have to regulate it, but it means you have less control over what's happening inside your body if you're just going with whatever's happening in the environment around you. You guys are still writing this slide, right? Not necessarily. There are plenty of single-celled organisms that are regulators. And there are some fish that are isotonic. So I think all of the hagfishes are isotonic, and so are our cartilaginous fishes like sharks, skates, and rays. So even getting up into vertebrates. So they are their own thing in their moment in time. So as they go through, so Pete's asking about fish that are able to go from saltwater to freshwater or from freshwater to saltwater. Some go back and forth. Those organisms are going to be hyperosmotic regulators in some environments and hypoosmotic regulators in others. And as they move, like as they make that migration, they completely change their physiology. Like they totally change. They have to in order to maintain water balance. And they go undergo pretty impressive physiological changes. It's a whole signaling system that controls that. Anadromous and how do you pronounce? Catadromous? Yes. I can never pronounce it right. And it's like, it doesn't come out right. Which has to do with whether they start in fresh water and go to salt or.
Megan, is it anadromous start in fresh water, go to salt, and come back to fresh?
That was where you were going to ask that. I was thinking about it. I can't
remember. Salmon or anadromous?
Yeah, I think
I can get that far.
Don't re-change when they enter back to the river, and that's why they all die when they come in.
Yeah.
Slowly breaking down, they're not ready to be in.
And then they just die.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that
like shad come up and die.
Shad sometimes they get back, so I don't know if their body.
Yeah. I don't know.
They start here, go down, they come back up.
Yeah. In their bodies, I think it's like gene transcription change. I think they actually change their what they have for sodium pumps and those kinds. Like I think they actually install proteins in their cell membranes or break down proteins in their cell membranes, if I remember correctly. It's been a long time since I thought about that fish physiology. Transcription translation, man. Environmental change triggers a change in gene expression, which triggers a body-wide response. Obviously, they've evolved to do it, and it's not so sudden because they go in and out through the estuary, right? There's a transition zone where they ramp up or ramp down. Because their physiology is so different. Yeah. Yeah. They just do, because they're amazing. Like I don't have a better answer because evolution is awesome, right? I don't know. I don't have a better answer than that. I'm sorry. I'm not a fish expert. Okay. I am a kangaroo expert until I get too big for my britches and Jay Gump stumps me. I have to go do some research now. But so if we look at an example of a freshwater fish, right? Freshwater fish is hanging out in freshwater, low solute concentration. So the body concentration is higher than the surrounding water. Water wants to come in by osmosis. It's going to come in part through drinking. It's going to diffuse in through the gill surface, and it's going to leave through the kidneys. Most of the rest of the body is coated in a slime, a mucus substance, right? That's part of their waterproofing. They're trying to reduce how much water is coming in through their body and drop down cutaneous absorption. So their scales and their slime coating help to reduce water coming in. So they're really leakiest at their mouth and their gills, okay, in terms of absorbing from the outside environment. They don't drink. So when they bring in food, water comes in, right? They either push that water over the gills or sometimes close the back of their mouth and spit water out. And so they push the food in and spit the water back out in order to try to reduce how much water they bring in. It can be both behavioral and physiological. And then to try to balance out salt, they get some salt in through with their food. They also actively pump salt in through their gills via active transport. So they're pulling salt from the fresh water to try to bring their ion balance up. And then they're going to have a very dilute, copious urine that excretes large amounts of water and retains salt. And so they're going to try to conserve as much salt as possible in the kidneys and then dump out excess water from their urinary waste in order to deal with their environment. Do you have a question? Alejandro does, though. Right. Well, all fish are going to have some amount of waterproofing through their scales as a barrier because the scales are non-living. And so even if they didn't have any slime coating, the scales themselves reduce exchange over the body surface. The slime helps to further reduce that exchange. But if you look at like all fish, there's a phenomenal diversity of species of fish. There's going to be a continuum of degree of barrier, right? Whether you want more leakiness or less leakiness.
So, like, I think the ones with like more of a skin.
More of a leathery skin.
Yeah,
Yep.
that would be
Yep.
increased protection. Would you know that?
I don't know what their what is their water loss at the surface. I don't know, but that leathery tissue is also a barrier. Just like, I mean, our skin is a barrier to water exchange with our environment, right? Anytime you have some sort of keratinized surface, it's going to be forming a barrier. I don't know where on the continuum catfish fall versus freshwater fish versus saltwater fish. But saltwater fish also are using a barrier between them and the environment. They're also going to have a slime coating of some sort, but it's not as copious in some cases. They're still experiencing most of the leaking at their mouth and their gill surfaces where they're directly exposed to flowing water, right? Saltwater fish are going to actively drink water, so they're trying to bring water in. Even though they're bringing salt with that water, they're going to actively drink. And then they're going to have special mechanisms at the gill to pump salt out. So they're bringing in some of that salt as they're drinking, and then they're pumping their excess salt out through their gills. They're also going to lose water via osmosis at the gill surface and gain salt. So they're going to have to constantly, be countering that. They produce a really concentrated urine, and so they actually dump as much extra salt as they can into their small amount of urine and void it away, but they retain as much water as possible. So they try to produce small quantities with very little fluid and some salt dumping in the urine as well. They also void excess ions like calcium and magnesium, some in the urine and some in the feces. They actually have some mechanisms to pump excess ions into their undigested waste material and get it out that way. So they're constantly bringing in ions, but they have mechanisms to try to pump them back out. And then they're going to drink, even though that brings in more ions, in order to conserve the water. They're really these guys are really focusing on dumping excess ions, whereas freshwater fish are really focusing on dumping extra water. Okay. And then our isotonic organisms either allow their body fluids to be at equilibrium or actively work to keep their body fluids at equilibrium with the surrounding environment. And so an example of working to make that happen are the chondrichthyes fishes. So sharks, skates, rays, chimeras, all of the cartilaginous fishes actually dump urea back into their blood in order to increase the solute concentration of their blood. And so they're actively managing a high solute concentration in their blood in order to remain at equilibrium with the surrounding environment. don't know, honestly. I don't know about shark sensitivity to environmental changes. So if they are really sensitive, I don't know why. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Honestly, I have no idea. I know that sharks are really sensitive, but usually to having their fins chopped off by humans or being tortured by humans or being captured as byproduct. But I don't know about their physiological sensitivity to environmental changes. Okay. Let's just finish this up. I have a couple more slides and then we're done with this section and I'll give you a break. Terrestrial animals also have to deal with water balance, right? We are not exempt from dealing with water balance. In some cases, it's harder because we have to find a way to bring water into our body on dry land, right? I know that I'm obsessed with kangaroo rats. I accept that. But kangaroo rats are the physiology textbook example of like doing this amazingly well in a dry, arid environment. And so there are a number of different ways that you can prevent water loss if you're a terrestrial animal. You can come up with ways to decrease evaporation. So our skin is not perfectly impermeable, right? We lose some water through our skin and we gain some oxygen through our skin. We do like less than 1% of our total oxygen need is met through cutaneous respiration. It's not a perfect barrier, right? But we can increase the impermeability of the barrier by adding things to it. So kangaroo rats actually have a special gland. I can tell that this individual is a captive animal living in captivity because you can see the color of its hair here. They have a gland at the base of their neck that secretes a large quantity of pretty thick, oily solution, and that oil rubs over their hairs and works like dipping yourself in oil, right? Making yourself more water impermeable. It provides a barrier. They take special dust baths to both distribute this oil and to remove excess dirt that clings to it and builds up. So they find a good sandy spot to deal with maintaining that, but that oil gland helps to decrease evaporation. You can actively drink water. Kangaroo rats are so amazing that they don't drink water. They don't know what to do with it if you give it to them. We, as other mammals, we drink water to meet our water balance needs, right? We get thirsty. We have to add more water to meet our balance. We can absorb water from food, which is what kangaroo rats do. You absorb water both because some of the foods that you eat are moist or juicy, right? You take in the water of a plant when you consume it. When you bite an insect, you take all of the fluids of the inside of that insect's body into your mouth. But you can also retain metabolic water, which is a different source of water, right? That's the water that's produced by cellular respiration as a byproduct of cellular respiration. And so you have the food that directly comes in the moisture of your food, the water that comes in the moisture of your food, and then you have the metabolic water that you can retain. Then you can reduce water loss in your excrement. And that's the thing that kangaroo rats are famous for in the physiology textbooks, which is that they have the longest known loops of Henle of any mammal. And so they have these really, really long ducts in the kidneys that collect all of the water and they produce a very, very dry waste material. So organisms that live in arid environments tend to have, just like our freshwater or our saltwater fish producing very small quantities of urine, these guys produce almost no urine and a very, very dry feces. It's like a dry, hard pellet because they're extracting every bit of water back that they can. Depending on where you live in the terrestrial environment, if you live in a tropical rainforest, you don't have to deal with these things in the same extreme. Right? Depending on where you're at in the moisture availability continuum, you will do more or less of these things. Okay. And then my very last slide for this, I'm pretty sure this is the very last slide for this section, is to just briefly mention the endocrine system. Endocrine system, hugely important in mammals, hugely important in birds, somewhat less important in other vertebrates, and minimal to best in most invertebrates. So the endocrine system is something we really see as we move up our evolutionary tree of life. Those things that evolved earlier have considerably less endocrine system. The endocrine system is a series of glands and organs that are going to secrete hormones into the bloodstream for system-wide communication. So this is a way to send a signal to the whole body to do something in response to external stimulus or a concentration gradient change, right? The endocrine system controls physiological processes. So it tells other glands and organs when and how to act. Sort of a large scale way to send a signal to the whole body to do something in response. Right? Some of them work more localized, some of them have very large scale effects, but these are part of our hormonal control. Really prevalent in mammals and birds and some of the other vertebrates. I'm not going to say a bunch about the endocrine system. It's really important, but it's also like, it's really dangerous if it doesn't work well. But it can work mediocrely just fine. Like, it's not as critical as like, I can't get food, right? Okay. I wouldn't say that they don't need system-wide communication, and it's not completely absent. It's not as complex. And they have fewer organs of the endocrine system and fewer hormones. In some cases, none. Well, then you don't get all the bells and whistles. Like, what if you want to fly and run and have sex, right? Yeah. I think that, like, I'm pretty excited that my life is not as simple as a sponge's.